Hi, I'm Jennifer Bassett from Thriving Grade 5. I am so excited to talk to you today about using primary sources in your upper elementary classroom. I've been an upper elementary teacher for 20 years, and social studies is my very favorite subject to teach. I use primary sources to engage my students and get them interested in what we are studying. My goal for you at the end of this session is that you will have practical, ready-to-go tips and resources to help you start integrating primary sources into your social studies lessons. I have 3 questions for you to start with. Do you want your students to genuinely enjoy social studies class? Hopefully you do. Do you want to put away your history textbook for a while and spice up your lessons? Do you want your students' depth of historical knowledge to be deeper and more meaningful? If you answered yes to those questions, you are in the right place. Let's get started. We will begin with the basics. What are primary sources? Primary sources are resources created by someone who lived through, experienced, or witnessed a time period or event. The text of the Gettysburg Address is a primary source. Photographs from the Great Depression are a primary source. William Bradford's journal. William Bradford was the longtime governor of Plymouth, and he gives us first-hand accounts of what went on at Plymouth. Secondary sources are important too, but our students need to understand the difference between secondary sources and primary sources. We have lots of secondary sources in our libraries and in our classrooms, and secondary sources are great places to get information, but they are not original. They are not first-hand accounts or first-hand photographs or paintings. A secondary source is a resource created by someone who studied a primary source but didn't actually witness, experience, or live through an event or time period. Our textbooks are secondary sources. A children's picture book about Benjamin Franklin is a secondary source. A painting of the Jamestown Fort created in 1995, that is definitely a secondary source. The Jamestown Fort was created in the early 1600s, so over 300 years later, the person who created that painting certainly would not have been there. So that is a secondary source. Many times we can't talk to the people who witnessed an event or lived through a historical time period, but we can look at the interesting things they left behind, like objects, paintings, photographs, journals, and a lot more. This is a page that will be in your downloadable resources that I provided. This right here just explains in simple terms for students what are primary sources, what are secondary sources, and then they will color in based on if the source being used is a primary source or secondary source. So good introduction there for your students. Why you must use primary sources in social studies class? Well, they make history come to life. For example, when learning about Jamestown's starving time, which approach do you think would engage students more? So, approach 1. The teacher says they had nothing to eat. They had to resort to eating things a person would never usually consider eating. Or opening the lesson with an excerpt of George Percy's account of the starving time, his first-hand account. He was there, he saw the starving time happen. This was a little piece of his journal about it. Then, having fed upon horses and other beasts, as long as they lasted, we were glad to make shift with vermin, as dogs, cats, rats, and mice. I think that would make much more of an impact on students than that first just teacher talk. Primary sources help our students dive deeper into history. There's only so much that we can do in social studies class to help our students understand the colonial era from textbooks or informational texts. But when they can see objects that colonists use daily and hear their words and see their faces in portraits, history becomes real and tangible. Primary sources help our students build connections and critical thinking skills. When we're showing primary sources from different aspects of the same period, students are able to make connections. This is an example of the connections that students can make. The blue is a quote from Patrick Henry's speech in 1775. The red is a quote from Samuel Seabury. So Patrick Henry is a patriot, of course, and he says, "Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." So obviously a patriot point of view there. Samuel Seabury is a loyalist point of view. He says, "If I must be enslaved, let it be by a king at least, and not by a parcel of upstart, lawless committeemen." Strong words on both sides, right? And we can talk about how both of these men lived in colonial America and saw the situation with Great Britain and the colonies and had two very different perspectives. I also like to point out the mention of slavery in both of these. Patrick Henry mentions slavery, but Samuel Seabury also mentions slavery. But they're not talking about the chattel slavery that is going on in the 18th century. They're talking about being enslaved by Great Britain. So that also makes quite a stark contrast between what our 18th century people were saying about slavery and what was actually going on in the colonies with the buying, selling, and trading of human beings. Primary sources make history more applicable to our students' lives. It is easy to feel a connection to the past when you look at paintings and photographs or read the compelling words that someone left behind in a letter, a journal, or a diary. What if you have some challenges? Well, everyone has challenges when they are starting out with primary sources. One challenge you might run into is awkward phrasing. Some primary source terms just sound awkward to our modern ears. But a way to fix this is to show your students how to use context clues to find meaning. Context clues, that's a big ELA skill that we have to teach also. So use primary source historical documents to touch those context clues, and you hit 2 skills with 1 document. Overwhelming length. Well, some primary source texts are really, really long. Don't present full documents to students. I made this mistake as a young teacher. I had a full primary source document. I printed it off. I was so excited. I gave it out to my students and their eyes glazed over. You cannot present full documents to students. Use just a few lines or even a phrase or 2 that are meaningful to what you're teaching. Especially our upper elementary kiddos, they need it broken down for them. So just present a little bit at a time. Non-standard spellings. Well, today we have standardized spellings in spell check and dictionaries, but in early American history, they spelled things the way they sounded. So when students come to a difficult word, ask them to sound it out phonetically. Most of the time, it'll be pretty easy for them to figure out the unknown word. They added a lot of extra U's and O's, and sometimes they spell things very strangely, but if you take the time to phonetically sound it out, it'll make sense. Okay, what about grading and assessing? That can be a challenge too. So if students have completed a primary source analysis activity, but you're not quite sure how to grade their work, well, remember, students' interpretations of primary sources will vary greatly, just like students' interpretations of artwork. If your students are able to back up their responses, it's okay to give leeway. Responding and analyzing primary sources, this is not a multiple choice activity. They can have a number of different responses, and that's okay. As long as they can back it up, they're golden. Okay, I have two different ways that I introduce primary sources. And I'm going to share my first method with you. I think method one is probably my favorite. I display the primary source, but I give no explanation at all. Students have to discuss the primary source in partners or in small groups and make predictions about its use or meaning. One of my favorite primary sources to use with this method is Ben Franklin's Join or Die print. When we start out studying the French and Indian War, I'll show this print and they know what the French and Indian War was, but they have no clue why this snake is cut into pieces and what do those letters mean. And join or die, what is that supposed to mean? I give them a little time. They come up with really good ideas. It's a rare case when they actually predict exactly what this print means, but they come up with the most fascinating ideas. And after they've discussed it and had time to talk it out and make their predictions, then I explain what the primary source is, what is the meaning, how was it used, all of that good stuff. These two are resources that are in your downloadable resource packet that I provided. This is a resource primary resource on the Boston Massacre, and this uses method one. So students just have to follow the steps. You'll do front to back. So on the front side, they are looking at the source. They're discussing and describing it. They're trying to figure out how it might relate to the Boston Massacre. They're asking questions. And then on the back side, they find out what this primary source was. They reflect and make connections. So there's two of these in your downloads. Method two is also really good. For method two, you're going to show them the primary source and you're going to explain it up front. You'll give small groups of students time to examine the source and discuss what they notice and make inferences. One good example is, this is called The Repeal or the Funeral of Miss America stamp from 1766. This is British political satire. Explain this primary source up front because it only makes sense if students have some background knowledge about the Stamp Act and they need to understand what the child-size coffin is and why these ships are here in the background and why is the dog peeing on his shoe and why are they going to a cemetery. They need to understand that up front to be able to fully understand this primary source satire. I included 2 pages using method 2. So on this one, they are going to receive the information about the primary source up front, and then they'll notice details, ask questions, and make a connection. Same thing with the wax jack. When you are using primary sources, vocabulary is critical. Just like when students are reading a new text, if there are a lot of words they don't understand, they are definitely not going to comprehend what they are reading. Whenever you have a primary source that's heavy with vocabulary, definitely front load that vocabulary. Tell them what those words mean before they dive into the primary source, and that will help them to have much greater understanding and comprehension of that primary source. This is an example of a primary source front-loading activity that I do with the preamble to the Constitution. This is in our interactive notebooks. On one side, we write the original words, and then on the other side, we write the modern words so that it's easier for students to, say, understand what domestic tranquility is. When they actually read the primary source by themselves, they have that knowledge of the vocabulary. Dramatizing primary sources is an amazing way to get your students interested and engaged in history, but you have to be careful. Students will definitely remember and understand the primary source if they are actively involved in dramatizing it. It's fun. It gets them out of their seat. It leads to high levels of student engagement. This is a fun primary source that is interesting to dramatize. It's a 1775 British political cartoon. One of the men in the chariot, I think it's this guy here, is King George III. The horses pulling the chariot are called Pride and Obstinacy. They are leading Great Britain down here into this abyss, which is war with the American colonies. It's fun to have students, get in a chair. If you're not too worried about safety, they can get in a chair on top of a desk, but, only if it's safe. And have some of these people, dramatize, show what this primary source would look like in real life. I love to point out how the horses are trampling over the Magna Carta and the Constitution. And I love the discussions that students have when they realize that not everyone in Great Britain wanted war with the colonies. A lot of regular people were angry that Great Britain was already stretched so thin across the world, fighting on all of these different fronts, and then they're starting up this war with the American colonies. So this is a good way to show students that not everyone in England wanted to fight the colonies. So a word of caution, be very careful when choosing primary sources to dramatize. There are some sensitive and painful topics that should never be dramatized by students. Examples are slavery, Native American removal. Those should never be dramatized. They're too painful. Primary sources in students' lives. Our students don't realize that they have primary sources all around them in the form of family members. Our older family members are treasure troves of information. Asking students to talk to older family members, especially those grandparents and great-grandparents if they still have them, provide firsthand accounts of events and eras. This builds family bonds, and it solidifies their understanding of how important primary sources are. One example of this that I give my students is my own grandma. My grandma, her name was Aline. She grew up in the 1920s and 30s in rural Oklahoma during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. She told me the best stories about things surrounding the Great Depression. And so this is the example research project that I use with my students. Of course, I'm much older than them. Their events that they talk to their family members about will be probably much more recent events, but they will get to hear and capture these wonderful stories that their family members can tell them about what life was like at a certain time or during a certain event. Examining events from multiple perspectives. That is a big ELA standard for our upper elementary kids. Primary sources can help us to showcase events and time periods from multiple perspectives and angles. So, for example, during the American Revolution, there were 4 major perspectives. There were patriots, loyalists, neutralists, and Native Americans. We can look at lots of different perspectives and angles using those 4 viewpoints. So where do you find primary sources? Well, we can find engaging, varied primary sources using a simple Google search. There are lots of primary sources out there, but remember, you will want to use a variety of primary sources. You don't want to always just use journal entries or just use photographs or portraits. You want to use a variety of sources. So look in different places from time to time. These are my go-to websites for finding and downloading primary sources. The Library of Congress has a huge variety from all eras of American history. Archives.gov is a great place to get an original copy of the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. So Archives is going to be more of your text-based documents, but I have seen some photographs on there too. Mount Vernon Online Archives, if you go to mountvernon.org, go under education, they have so many amazing primary source objects and texts that you can look at that all relate to Mount Vernon or people who were somehow connected to Mount Vernon. Smithsonian Open Access and Met Open Access are both amazing. They have primary source objects, photographs, texts, portraits, everything you can think of. NYPL, New York Public Library, they have a digital collection site, and they have many, not just books or texts, they have objects and photographs and paintings. So definitely check out any and all of these sources to find good primary sources to use in your classroom. I want to thank you for attending my presentation. I wish you all of the best on your primary source journey. Please reach out to me through my website, thrivinggrade5.com, or I have my email address listed in your downloadable resource packet that you can grab and email me. Let me know if you have questions or need recommendations for any sort of primary source activity. I hope to talk to you again soon.